At 02:17 hours on 18 November 1944, Sergeant Elijah Ford lay flat against the splintered parquet floor of a bombed-out third-story apartment on Rue des Alemans in the eastern quarter of Metz, France. The room had no windows, only jagged brick teeth where the wall had been torn away by artillery 2 days earlier. Cold air poured through the opening, carrying the smell of wet stone, old smoke, and cordite that never quite left the city anymore. The temperature hovered just above freezing, 36 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that Ford could see his breath ghost faintly against the rubble when he exhaled too hard. He did not exhale hard. Outside, the street below stretched 42 feet wide, slick with rain and powdered masonry. A shattered street lamp leaned at a 12-degree angle, its bulb miraculously intact, casting a weak yellow pool of light that fractured across shell craters and abandoned bicycles. Sound carried strangely in Metz at night, boots echoed, voices bounced, metal rang sharper than it should have. Ford's rifle lay tight against his body, the walnut stock pressed hard into the notch of his collarbone, harder than regulation ever taught. His torso was canted slightly left, legs splayed, elbows braced not on sandbags but on broken doorframe timber and chunks of brick. It was an old stance, one the men in his platoon had laughed at when they first saw it. "Looks like he's shootin' squirrels," one of them had said weeks earlier. Ford hadn't answered then, he didn't answer now. Below him, 20 German soldiers emerged from the darkness at the far end of the street, moving in a loose file. Their boots struck pavement with confidence. They believed this block was clear. The Americans had tried to cross it twice already that night. Both attempts ended the same way, machine gun fire from unseen angles, men dragged back bleeding, progress measured in feet instead of yards. 2 blocks behind Ford, an entire U.S. infantry company waited, pressed flat against cellar walls and doorways, stalled by this single urban kill zone. Ford was alone forward of them. No spotter, no radio. Just orders given quietly an hour earlier: if you can thin them out, do it. If not, get back alive. The Germans reached the broken street lamp. Ford smelled oil from his rifle's action, faint but familiar. He felt the cold steel of the receiver against his cheekbone, the rough grit biting into his left palm where shattered glass had already cut him. He ignored it. Blood was warm. Warmth was a liability. A German officer stepped into the light. Ford recognized him not by insignia but by posture, the way he stood straighter, the way the others unconsciously oriented toward him. The distance was 187 yards. Wind negligible, visibility poor but consistent. Ford counted his breaths: 1, 2, 3. The trigger broke at 5 pounds 6 ounces. The rifle's report was sharp but swallowed quickly by the ruined buildings. The muzzle flash lit the apartment for less than a heartbeat, long enough to show Ford the dust shaking loose from the ceiling. The officer below collapsed backward without a sound, helmet clattering once before settling. For half a second there was silence, then confusion. German voices snapped out commands, men crouched, rifles swung upward, searching windows, rooftops, shadows. Ford was already cycling the bolt, the brass casing flicking past his cheek and tinkling softly against the floor behind him. A second officer moved forward, trying to impose order. 163 yards, slight angle right to left. Ford adjusted by inches, his elbow grinding into brick. He fired. The man folded at the knees. Now panic edged the shouting. A third officer shouted something sharp and angry, stepping into the open as if proximity itself could control chaos. Ford felt the recoil through his chest, dull and heavy, absorbed by bone and floor and muscle trained over years. He did not lift his head, he did not rush. Each movement was small, economical. By 02:23 hours, 3 officers lay motionless in the street. The Germans began spreading out, boots scraping, probing doorways, firing blind shots into windows. A round snapped past the opening of Ford's apartment, close enough that he felt the air move. He waited, a 4th officer, then a 5th, each time the same result. By the time the 7th officer stepped forward, his silhouette framed in broken light, pistol raised, voice hoarse with shouting, Ford was down to his last round in the internal magazine. His fingers were numb, his breath fogged despite his control. Somewhere below, a German machine gun was being dragged into position. Ford settled deeper into the floor, cheek welded to cold steel, ancient stance holding steady as it always had. In the next 30 minutes, 7 German officers would die, and an entire American company would walk through a street that should have killed them all. Sergeant Elijah Ford was born in March 1918, in a brick row neighborhood pressed hard against the rail yards on the south edge of Springfield, Illinois. The houses were narrow, soot-darkened, and close enough that voices carried through thin walls in winter. Trains passed day and night, their iron wheels shrieking as they slowed for the junction, shaking loose plaster and rattling dishes in cupboards that were never quite full. His father, Thomas Ford, worked maintenance for the Illinois Terminal Railroad. By the time Elijah was 10, Thomas's hands were already misshapen, knuckles swollen, fingernails split and blackened, palms ridged with scar tissue that never faded. He spoke little, not out of mystery, but because words were inefficient. Things either held together or they didn't. If they didn't, you fixed them. Elijah learned early that the world rewarded precision and punished carelessness. He learned it hauling coal scuttles before dawn, fingers burning from cold steel. He learned it watching his father square a warped rail plate with a hammer blow placed just right, no wasted motion. And he learned it the first time he was trusted with a rifle, not as a toy, not as a sport, but as a necessary implement. The rifle was old even then, a surplus, 30-40 Krag, bought cheap and cleaned meticulously. Thomas Ford did not teach his son how to shoot standing proud and upright. He taught him how to shoot when tired, when cold, when lying on uneven ground with elbows sinking into mud. Muscle gets weak, his father said once, voice flat, bone don't. By 1932, the Depression had tightened its grip. Elijah left school at 14 to work nights at a freight depot, loading and unloading railcars by lantern light. He slept in broken increments and learned to function on little rest. The job paid poorly, but it paid steady. On weekends, when there was meat to be had, Elijah hunted outside town, not for trophies, but for calories. He hunted in bad weather because good weather was when other men were out. Rain, sleet, pre-dawn fog, those were his classrooms. He learned how sound traveled differently through damp woods, how breath fogged scopes, how hands numbed until the trigger felt like it belonged to someone else. Over 7 years, he fired thousands of rounds, almost always from compromised positions, kneeling in ditches, prone on frozen ground, twisted sideways against tree trunks. Without knowing it, Elijah Ford was building a firing discipline that ignored manuals entirely. By December 7, 1941, he was 23 and working as a night watchman for a grain elevator on the Sangamon River. The radio announcement came through static and disbelief. Pearl Harbor, ships burning, men trapped below decks. Elijah listened, finished his shift, and walked home in the cold. He enlisted 3 days later on 10 December 1941 at a draft office that smelled of wet wool and ink. He didn't make speeches. He signed his name carefully, the same way he did everything else. Basic training was conducted at Camp Walters, Texas, and it might as well have been another planet. Heat replaced cold, dust replaced mud. Instructors barked rules with absolute certainty. Elijah followed orders, but when it came time to shoot, friction emerged almost immediately. His stance was wrong. He leaned too much, pulled the rifle in too tight, braced against the ground instead of floating on muscle. An instructor corrected him once, then twice. On the third attempt, Elijah adjusted just enough to pass inspection, then returned to his way when eyes turned elsewhere. Targets fell regardless. Scores were good enough that questions stopped being asked, but not good enough to earn praise. Elijah was assigned as a rifleman, then later earmarked informally as a sharpshooter. When a range officer noticed, he grouped tighter after 12 hours on duty than most men did fresh. By early 1943, he was shipped overseas with the 95th Infantry Division, a unit that would later earn the nickname Iron Men of Metz. The Atlantic crossing was cold and foul. Men vomited over rails. Hammocks swayed. Elijah learned how to sleep standing up, braced between bulkheads. In England, the rain felt familiar. The mud felt honest. Training intensified. Urban combat drills were crude approximations, but Elijah paid attention to angles, to how walls framed sightlines, to how sound echoed down streets. Officers noticed his results and disliked his methods in equal measure. "That's not how the manual says," a lieutenant told him once, watching him shoot from a broken stairwell. Elijah nodded, adjusted nothing. Among enlisted men, he gained a nickname, Old Man, not for age but for how he did things, quiet, deliberate, unchanged by fashion or instruction. By September 1944, the 95th landed in France. They moved east through shattered towns, each one more ruined than the last. The first time Elijah smelled a city after shelling, burnt wood, ruptured sewer lines, cordite layered over everything, he thought of home in the rail yards and then pushed the thought away. Metz awaited them, a fortress city. Stone buildings turned into interlocking fields of fire, German officers who still believed in order, and Elijah Ford, who believed only in what worked, was about to prove that belief under fire. By the autumn of 1944, U.S. Army doctrine had been written by men who believed wars were won in fields. Rifle platoons advanced behind preparatory fires, machine guns suppressed. Officers moved forward to direct momentum. It worked in open country. It worked when sightlines extended hundreds of yards and enemy positions were obvious enough to be mapped and shelled. It did not work in Metz. The city was older than the doctrine trying to conquer it. Streets curved unpredictably, sometimes narrowing to less than 30 feet before opening into small squares overlooked by 4- and 5-story stone buildings. Cellars connected beneath roads, stairwells became firing points, every window was a potential muzzle. German defenders understood this intimately. They did not fight as a continuous line. They fought in nodes, officer-led pockets that waited allowed Americans to enter, and then collapsed streets into kill zones with overlapping fire. Once an advance stalled, German officers exposed themselves briefly, moving under cover to reassert control, redirect machine guns, or trigger local counterattacks. American rifle fire rarely reached them. Standard engagement distances in Metz were 60 to 200 yards, often vertical rather than horizontal. Rifles were accurate enough, but doctrine did not prioritize overwatch positions that could isolate command elements. There were no dedicated sniper teams assigned at company level, and few officers wanted to spare men for static roles while assaults stalled. The result was predictable. On 15 November 1944, at 14:40 hours, Private First Class Harold E. Klein, age 19 of Dayton, Ohio, was killed crossing an alley near the Moselle waterfront. A German officer appeared briefly in a second-story window and directed fire from an MG-42 set back in a cellar. Klein was hit twice in the chest. He died before the medic reached him. 2 hours later, Corporal James Ruddle, 27 from Scranton, Pennsylvania, was struck by shrapnel when a German officer lobbed a rifle grenade from behind a stone archway. Rutledge bled out against a bakery wall that still smelled faintly of burnt flour. The after-action report described both as advance casualties under heavy resistance. Elijah Ford saw them differently. On 16 November, during a night probe along Rue Haute, Private Samuel Ortega, 21, of Santa Fe, New Mexico, was shot in the throat at 74 yards. The German officer responsible exposed himself for less than 3 seconds, shouting an order before ducking back. No American rifle was positioned to answer. Ortega drowned on his own blood in less than a minute. Ford was kneeling beside him when it happened. He smelled copper and sewage and wet wool. He heard the wet rattle in Ortega's chest, felt the useless pressure of his own hand trying to seal a wound that could not be sealed. There was no drama in it, just math, time, distance, angles. This one was avoidable. That night Ford spoke to his platoon leader, quietly, no accusations. He described what he'd seen, where the officers appeared, how long they stayed visible. What kind of firing position could reach them? The lieutenant listened, then shook his head. Not our call, Sergeant. Company handles that. The next morning, Ford brought it to company, again, calmly. He suggested placing a single man forward and above the advance, not to engage riflemen, but to remove leadership when it appeared. He was careful with his words. He avoided terms like sniper. The captain frowned at the map. "We can't afford to pin men down in static positions," he said, "and what you're suggesting isn't doctrinal. We advance together." Ford nodded. He was dismissed. On 17 November, another attempt was made to cross the same sector. It failed in 12 minutes. That afternoon, Ford wrote a short proposal. 2 pages, distances measured, times observed. He handed it up through channels. It came back an hour later with a pencil mark in the margin, not approved. No signature, no explanation. Ford did not argue. He did not complain to the men. He cleaned his rifle and counted his ammunition. He thought about bone and muscle, about angles and patience. About the fact that every German officer who stepped into the open bought his men another few seconds of coordination, and that those seconds cost American lives. At 23:50 hours, he selected a position without orders. A bombed-out apartment overlooking Rue des Alemans. It offered elevation, concealment, and clear lines of sight. It also offered no support, no escape route, and no authorization. If discovered, he would be on his own. At 2:17 hours, Sergeant Elijah Ford lay down on the shattered floor and waited for officers to do what officers always did. Elijah Ford's rifle was an M1903A3 Springfield, stamped Remington, its parkerized finish dulled further by weeks of grime and handling. It weighed 7 pounds unloaded, balanced slightly forward with a 24-inch barrel that had never once failed him. The rifle wore no glass, no scope, only iron, an adjustable rear aperture, and a front blade darkened deliberately with candle soot to kill reflection. Ford had been told more than once that optics were the future. He had nodded politely and continued to trust what could not fog, crack, or betray him with a glint. His firing method offended instructors because it looked wrong. The body was angled roughly 22 degrees off the line of fire, not square. The stock was pulled hard into the collarbone, tighter than regulation allowed. The sling was cinched not for comfort but for skeletal support, transferring recoil into bone rather than muscle. Elbows were not floated, they were planted into dirt, into wood, into brick, whatever would not move. It was old, it was inelegant, and it did not drift. In the days before the engagement, Ford tested it quietly. He dry-fired in abandoned stairwells, timing the echo. He marked brick chips as reference points for elevation. He counted how long German officers stayed visible when issuing orders. 2 seconds if cautious, 4 if angry, 6 if they believed themselves safe. At 1:55 hours on 18 November, the weather settled into a light mist. Visibility hovered at 220 yards. Wind from the northwest at 2 miles per hour, negligible. Temperature, 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Ford climbed into the bombed-out apartment without orders and without witnesses. He cleared loose debris with his hands, ignoring the glass. He lay prone, adjusted his sling, and loaded 5 rounds into the internal magazine. 1 remained on the floor beside him. At 2:17, the Germans entered the street. The first officer appeared at 187 yards. Ford exhales, half-holds, squeezes. The officer falls backward. No scream, no flourish. Ford cycles the bolt in 1.3 seconds, muscle memory precise despite the cold. The casing kisses his cheek as it passes. He does not look. At 02:19, a second officer steps into the open, shouting, 163 yards. Angle -6 degrees, Ford adjusts by a finger's width, fires. The man collapses forward, helmet skidding. The street erupts in confusion. Rifles crack upward. A round snaps through the apartment opening, close enough to move air. Brick dust sprinkles Ford's sleeve. At 02:21, the third officer appears. 141 yards. Ford waits an extra half-second, letting the man square his shoulders. Shot placement is mechanical. The result is immediate. By 02:23, German movement becomes erratic. Orders overlap, men retreat into doorways. An MG-42 is dragged forward, its crew leader exposed for just long enough. Ford takes him at 128 yards. His left hand is bleeding now. He feels it when the sling pulls taut. He ignores it. The fifth officer tries to rally men from behind a burned-out truck, 109 yards. Partial obstruction. Ford angles the barrel 3 degrees right and fires through the gap. Silence follows, thick and unnatural. At 02:31, 2 officers move together, one pointing, one shouting. Ford does not hesitate. First shot drops the speaker. Second shot, his last loaded round, takes the man behind him as he turns. 7 officers, 20 minutes. The street below becomes leaderless. German fire slackens, then fractures into isolated shots. Men withdraw without coordination, dragging wounded, abandoning the machine gun. Ford remains still for another 10 minutes, rifle empty, listening. At 02:47, American boots enter the street. They move cautiously at first, then faster. No one is hit. No one fires back. Ford withdraws before dawn, unremarked, leaving behind 7 bodies and a stretch of stone that no longer killed Americans. The first thing that spread through the companies fighting in Metz was not a report, it was a rumor. Men noticed that certain streets no longer killed them. That advances, which had stalled for hours, now unfolded in minutes. That when German fire came, it came late, disorganized, lacking the sharp, immediate response that had defined earlier encounters. Nobody put Elijah Ford's name on it. Names made things official. Official things required explanations. But men talked. They talked about how someone had taken out German officers before they could settle into control. About how a single rifle, placed high and forward, had broken the rhythm of the defense. They talked quietly in cellars and stairwells between shellings. Within 48 hours, other squads began doing the same thing. Not snipers, not formally, just good shots sent upstairs early. Men positioned in attics, clock towers, second-story ruins, not to fire constantly, but to wait. Casualty figures told the story even when paperwork would not. In the week prior to 18 November 1944, Ford's regiment averaged 1 casualty for every 22 men attempting urban crossings in contested blocks. In the week following, that number dropped to 1 in 47. Advances that once required smoke, artillery, and repeated assaults were executed with fewer rounds fired and less hesitation. No memo credited the change. After-action reports spoke of improved coordination and reduced enemy effectiveness. German resistance was described as uneven. Elijah Ford received no citation, no commendation. His platoon leader mentioned his initiative once off the record and advised him to be more careful about where he put himself next time. Ford nodded. The Germans noticed the change as well. By early December, officers stopped exposing themselves. Orders were passed from cover. Leadership